So, Greg, when I was going through the public defender data for the cases that I chose, I noticed that the life without parole cases on average were costing about $5,500 versus closer to $60,000 for the death penalty cases. What are some of the things that accounts for that difference from the public defense?
Well, the main difference is that in the death penalty cases, you have to do what's called mitigation, which means you have to prepare for a penalty phase. And that's really like an entirely separate trial. You've got to do extensive investigation of the defendant's background, which means you have to investigate their family, their school history, their mental health history. The mental health history is often very expensive to investigate because you may have to hire experts, various kinds of doctors for the case, who can really evaluate the defendant's mental health, both in terms of why they committed the crime, if that's what the defense theory is, and also in terms of why they should not receive the death penalty. So that really, that very intensive investigation is really what tends to make the death penalty cases more expensive than the regular first-degree murder cases where the state is not seeking the death penalty.
And I'm guessing all that stuff that you just mentioned also would come into play during the appeals process.
Yes, there tend to be far more extensive appeals in a death penalty case than in a non-death penalty case. There are a number of state appeals that a person who is sentenced to death gets to go through, and then there are federal appeals that a person sentenced to death gets to go through. And those tend to be much more time-consuming and tend to also involve a lot of investigation and a lot of expert witnesses. And that also tends to make the cases more expensive than a case in which the state is not seeking the death penalty.
Right. Can you briefly explain what the difference is between the direct and the indirect costs that the public defender's office incurs?
Well, the direct costs, I would say, would be things such as costs for hiring expert witnesses, for example, the doctors that I talked about. The direct costs would also be for other types of experts, such as maybe to examine ballistics or to examine DNA evidence or to do a pathology report. Those would be additional costs that the public defender would have. Indirect costs would be things perhaps to pay the salaries of the defense team. In a death penalty case, you have a larger defense team than in a non-death penalty case. For example, the American Bar Association guidelines for defense of death penalty cases call for having 2 attorneys on a case, 2 defense attorneys, an investigator, and a mitigation specialist. The mitigation specialist is the person who investigates the life history of the defendant. That defense team is larger than what you have in a non-death penalty case, and that is something that the public defender has to pay. There's also travel expenses involved in a death penalty case that you tend not to have in a non-death penalty case. Because you have to investigate the client's life history, you've got to go see where the client was born, interview former teachers of the client, interview former employers of the client. Just a vast amount of interviews that you do in death penalty cases that you don't do in the non-death penalty case. And that travel and those interviews can be expensive for the defense team. So those things also tend to push up the cost.
Recently, some state lawmakers who support the death penalty have floated the idea of trying to, either set time limits for the appeals process, or try to put in what they would view as cost controls. From what you have heard, how effective, if at all, would those proposals be, and what potential side effects could they have?
Well, there are already time limits for the appeals. For example, you have to file what's called a post-conviction case within 90 days in Missouri of losing your direct appeal. So there already are some time limits in existence. So speeding up those time limits further would frankly probably just increase the risk, especially that an innocent person might be convicted, because the time limits are actually quite short already. The delays that you hear about in the death penalty are usually not that common in Missouri state courts. Where they may be occurring more is in the federal system, when you get to the federal side of the equation. So the real problem with speeding up the time in the state court is that it raises the specter of an actually innocent person being convicted and sentenced to death, because there isn't the time available to do the intensive investigation that's necessary, particularly of innocence, to try to show that an innocent person may have been convicted. And we have had, I believe, 3 people exonerated in Missouri who were sentenced to death and then later released because they were found to be innocent.
All right. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I don't think so.